They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They didn't even pretend to treat me like a human being who lived here. The first sign appeared early on a Monday morning, nailed crookedly into the old wooden fence my grandmother had repaired with her own hands years before she passed. Bright orange, laminated, official-looking. It said HOA violation, unauthorized use of common property. And seeing those words on land I'd grown up running across felt like being accused of a crime I didn't understand yet. I stood there barefoot in the grass, coffee going cold in my hand, wondering how a place that had always meant safety suddenly felt hostile. By the end of that week, the sign wasn't an accident or a mistake anymore. It was a message. My mailbox filled with certified letters warning me of fines. My email pinged constantly with messages marked urgent, each one colder than the last. They accused me of trespassing, of refusing compliance, of violating rules I'd never agreed to. What made it worse was the CC list. My neighbors, people I'd waved to for years, people who knew this land had been my family's long before the HOA existed. Suddenly, my name was being circulated like a problem everyone should stay away from. The harassment didn't stop at paper. They sent text messages reminding me of daily penalties. They posted updates on the HOA group board, carefully written to sound neutral while painting me as defiant and dangerous. Words like non-compliant homeowner and legal enforcement followed my name everywhere. I could feel eyes on me when I walked outside. Conversations stopped when I passed. One neighbor quietly told me the HOA had warned them not to get involved if they didn't want trouble of their own. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control. Inside my house, the pressure leaked into every room. My wife asked if we'd done something wrong. My kids overheard conversations they weren't meant to hear and started asking why the HOA was mad at us, why people were calling our home illegal. I didn't have answers that made sense to them or to myself. All I knew was that the ground beneath us, the same ground my grandmother had sworn would always protect us, was being redefined without our consent. Every notice felt more aggressive than the last. Fines multiplied, deadlines shortened, the language shifted from warnings to commands. I started sleeping lightly, half expecting someone to show up with a clipboard and a badge, telling us to leave. The emotional weight was constant, like standing in a storm that never moved on. I kept thinking about my grandmother, about how she used to say land remembers who loves it. Standing there, watching strangers claim it with letterhead and threats, I felt like I was failing her. Then came the notice that changed everything. Folded neatly, delivered without ceremony, it stated that according to updated records, the land was no longer mine, effective immediately. Karen Holloway said my full name slowly, like it was already written on a lawsuit. She stood at the edge of my driveway with a clipboard tucked against her chest. Posture perfect, smile practiced, eyes cold. The way she spoke wasn't loud or aggressive, but it carried weight, the kind that makes you feel smaller even when you're standing on your own property. She didn't introduce herself like a neighbor. She introduced herself like authority, like someone who expected obedience before conversation even began. This was our first face-to-face meeting, but it was obvious I wasn't meeting her for the first time. She already knew everything about me, where I worked, how long I'd lived here, that the land had belonged to my grandmother. She spoke as if she'd rehearsed this moment, as if my confusion and frustration were just boxes to check off on her way to a predetermined outcome. Her politeness felt staged, overly sweet, the kind that dares you to react so she can justify whatever comes next. She told me the board unanimously agrees that the land fell under HOA control. The way she said it made it sound final, irreversible, like a verdict had already been handed down. When I asked when this vote happened, who attended, and why I hadn't been notified, her smile tightened. She waved off my questions as procedural details, not worth slowing things down. According to her, the decision existed simply because she said it did. The board was a shield she hid behind, even though I could tell she was the one pulling every string. As she spoke, she casually mentioned consequences. Liens placed quietly but efficiently. Legal fees that would add up fast. Foreclosure, said gently, as if she were warning me about bad weather instead of threatening to take my home. Every word was chosen carefully, designed to sound helpful while making one thing clear. Resistance would be expensive. She never raised her voice, never lost control, which somehow made it worse. This wasn't anger. This was confidence backed by preparation. I told her the land predated the HOA, that my grandmother had documents, boundaries, history. She nodded, already dismissing it. She said records change, surveys get updated, and mistakes are corrected all the time. The way she said corrected made my stomach turn. It wasn't reassurance, it was erasure. She spoke like someone who'd already seen the paperwork and knew I was about to be buried under it. What unsettled me most was how comfortable she was standing there, on land she claimed wasn't mine, talking about my future as if it belonged to her. There was no hesitation, no doubt. That kind of confidence doesn't come from guesswork. It comes from planning, from meetings held without you, from decisions made quietly, long before you realize you're being targeted. Before she left, she leaned in slightly and lowered her voice, as if sharing a secret. She told me a corrected survey had already been filed, one that proved everything she just said. She smiled again, turned, and walked away, leaving me standing there with the unsettling feeling that this fight had started long before I even knew I was in it. I laughed when Grandma warned me, until her fear became my reality. Standing alone in the yard after Karen Holloway walked away, her words echoing in my head about surveys and authority, I heard my grandmother's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside me. She used to say that land doesn't get taken all at once, it gets taken inch by inch, buried under paperwork and smiles. Back then, I thought she was being dramatic, holding on to old worries that didn't belong in a modern neighborhood with sidewalks and HOA newsletters. Now, with violation notices piling up and strangers claiming ownership of my family's soil, her warnings felt prophetic. Some of my earliest memories are of walking the boundary lines with her. She'd move slowly, pointing out trees, fence posts, stones half buried in the dirt, explaining what belonged to us and why. She treated those walks like lessons, not just about property, but about responsibility. Know what's yours, she'd tell me, because someone else will always try to tell you it isn't. At the time, I was a kid more interested in getting back to the house than memorizing landmarks. I never imagined those details would matter this much. Years later, when developers started sniffing around, she didn't budge. I remember men in press shirts pulling into the driveway, talking about growth, community, and opportunity. They promised higher property values and easier living if she'd just sign here, adjust there, cooperate. She refused every time. She didn't raise her voice or slam doors. She simply said no and meant it. After they left, she'd shake her head and tell me that progress often comes disguised as permission slips you'll regret signing. Her distrust of HOAs ran deep. She'd read every document, every clause, every footnote, convinced that language could be twisted to mean whatever the powerful needed it to mean. She warned me that paperwork outlives people, and if it's wrong or incomplete, it becomes a weapon. I brushed it off when she passed, assuming those battles ended with her. I thought inheritance meant security. I was wrong. As the harassment intensified, regret settled in. I regretted not sitting with her longer at the kitchen table when she tried to explain deeds and easements. I regretted assuming that common sense would protect me. Most of all, I regretted not taking her fear seriously when she told me to be careful, to never assume that because something had always been ours, it always would be. That night I went digging through the old cabinet where she kept important papers. Deeds, tax receipts, letters neatly bundled with twine. At the bottom was an envelope I remembered but had never opened, marked with my name in her handwriting. She'd told me it was part of her will, something to be handled properly, with a lawyer, when the time came. I'd delayed it out of grief, then out of convenience, telling myself it could wait. Holding that envelope now, with the HOA circling and Karen's confidence still fresh in my mind, I felt a knot form in my chest. Whatever was inside had been meant for this moment. Whatever she'd prepared because she knew someone like Karen Holloway would eventually show up, smiling and certain, ready to claim what wasn't hers. What scared me most was realizing the will had never been legally reviewed. Every morning cost me money, just for existing. I learned that the hard way when I started opening my email before I even got out of bed, bracing myself for whatever the HOA had decided I'd done wrong overnight. Another fine, another administrative fee, another penalty stacked neatly on top of the last one, all time-stamped like proof that my life was being audited in real time. It didn't matter that nothing had changed. The land was still there. The fence hadn't moved. I hadn't built, altered, or touched a thing. Existing on my own property was enough. The fines weren't random. They were methodical, calculated to overwhelm. $50 a day became $100. Late fees were added to fines that were already disputed. Interest appeared without explanation. Within weeks, the total climbed into the thousands. Numbers so large, they stopped feeling real and started feeling like a threat. Each notice ended with the same line: failure to comply may result in further action. They never explained what compliance actually meant, only that I wasn't doing it. Then came the phone call that made my stomach drop. A representative, reading from a script, informed me that unpaid fines could lead to a lien on my property. She said it calmly, like she was explaining a parking ticket. When I pushed back, told her the land was under dispute, she transferred me to someone else who mentioned wage garnishment as a last resort. The words echoed in my head long after the call ended. They weren't just coming after the land anymore. They were coming after my ability to provide for my family. Things started going wrong around the house not long after that. Our water pressure dropped suddenly, then shut off completely for half a day. The utility company claimed it was a clerical error related to a boundary issue. Power flickered twice in 1 week. Each time, I was told it was unrelated, just unfortunate timing, but timing was all I could see. Every inconvenience felt intentional, like someone testing how far they could push before I broke. The fear wasn't loud. It was quiet and constant. It sat with us at dinner, crept into conversations, followed us to bed. My wife started asking what would happen if they really did put a lien on the house. My kids noticed the tension even when we tried to hide it. Stability, something I'd always taken pride in providing, suddenly felt fragile, and I knew that was the point. They weren't trying to win an argument. They were trying to exhaust me. When I confronted Karen about the fines, she didn't deny them. She reframed them. She called them compliance encouragement, said they were designed to motivate homeowners to cooperate for the good of the community. She spoke as if I were being unreasonable for feeling targeted. According to her, if I'd just stop resisting, everything would calm down. The implication was clear. Silence would be rewarded. Resistance would be punished. Each message from the HOA grew sharper, less patient. The language shifted again, from warnings to ultimatums. They gave me deadlines measured in days, not weeks. The stress felt physical, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I started to understand why people give up, why they sign things they shouldn't, why they walk away from land that's been in their family for generations. It's not because they're wrong, it's because they're tired. The final notice arrived on a Friday afternoon, marked urgent and delivered both electronically and by certified mail. It stated that if I failed to comply immediately, the HOA would initiate legal action. Reading it, I realized they weren't trying to scare me anymore. They were telling me what was coming next. One crooked line turned my family history into HOA scrap. That was the thought pounding in my head as I stared at the survey Karen had so confidently referenced. The one she claimed settled everything. On paper, it looked clean and professional, stamped and signed, full of precise angles and measurements that pretended to be objective. But the more I studied it, the more it felt like a rewrite, not a record. According to that single document, my land didn't exist the way it always had. It had been absorbed, quietly and completely, into HOA common property. What bothered me immediately were the landmarks. The survey showed boundary lines cutting through areas I knew by heart. Trees that had stood for decades were missing. The old fence line was shifted just enough to claim it had never been where my grandmother built it. Even the creek that curved naturally along the edge of the property was drawn straighter, tamed on paper in a way nature never allowed. Anyone unfamiliar with the land might not notice, but I did. You don't forget places you've walked since childhood. I took the survey to the county records office, hoping for clarity. Instead, I found confusion. The clerk behind the counter flipped through files, frowning, typing, then stopping to check again. She told me the filing dates didn't line up. Some references pointed to records that should have existed but didn't appear in the system. Others referenced amendments without original documents attached. She wasn't accusing anyone outright, but her uncertainty said enough. Records don't usually just vanish. As we went deeper, more gaps appeared. Historic markers that should have been noted were absent. Older boundary descriptions referenced objects that no longer appeared anywhere in the official files. It was as if someone had copied only the parts of history that suited them and discarded the rest. The survey wasn't just inaccurate, it was selective, and that selectivity felt intentional. The clerk finally leaned back in her chair and lowered her voice. She said disputes like this weren't uncommon when newer developments overlapped older properties. Sometimes, she explained, surveys were commissioned with a specific outcome in mind. Lines were drawn to favor whoever was paying. It wasn't illegal on its own, she said carefully, but it became a problem when those surveys were treated as unquestionable truth. Hearing that made my stomach tighten. Karen's confidence suddenly made sense. I thought about how quickly the HOA had acted, how prepared they'd been with fines, threats, and paperwork. This survey hadn't been created in response to me. It had been waiting, designed to erase inconvenient history and replace it with something easier to control. My grandmother's refusal to sell, her insistence on boundaries, all of it had likely marked this land as a problem long before I inherited it. Before I left, the clerk paused and told me there might be something else. She mentioned archived deeds from the 1950s, records that hadn't been digitized, files most people never asked for anymore. They were kept off-site, she said, rarely requested, but sometimes those old documents told a very different story. As I walked out of the office, survey rolled under my arm. I felt the fight shifting. If the HOA was relying on one crooked line, I needed to find the lines that came before it. She smiled when she said lawsuit. Not a nervous smile, not a reluctant one, but the kind that comes from certainty. The kind that says this is exactly where she wanted things to go. The HOA board meeting had been called with less than 48 hours notice, labeled as an emergency session, even though nothing about it felt sudden to me. Walking into that room, I realized quickly this wasn't a discussion. It was an ambush, carefully staged, with me as the lone target. Karen sat at the head of the table, papers stacked neatly in front of her, posture relaxed. She didn't look at me right away. Instead, she addressed the room, summarizing the situation in a calm, authoritative tone that stripped away every ounce of context. According to her, I was a non-compliant homeowner refusing to accept verified records. She framed my resistance as disruptive, irresponsible, even dangerous to the community. By the time she finally said my name, it already sounded like a liability. Every time I tried to speak, she redirected. She answered questions that weren't asked and dismissed the ones that were. When I mentioned the inconsistencies in the survey and the missing records at the county office, she waved it off as irrelevant speculation. She reminded everyone that the HOA had a duty to protect shared property and that allowing exceptions would set a dangerous precedent. The way she spoke, you'd think I was asking for special treatment instead of defending land my family had owned for generations. Around the table, the other board members avoided my eyes. Some stared at their notes. Others pretended to review documents they clearly weren't reading. No one challenged Karen. No one asked for clarification. Their silence was louder than anything said out loud. It told me they were either afraid, complicit, or both. This wasn't leadership. It was compliance under pressure. Then came the vote. Karen didn't allow discussion. She didn't summarize alternatives. She simply announced that legal action was necessary and called for a motion. A hand went up. Then another. It happened fast, almost mechanically, like they were checking boxes on a form already filled out. I noticed how she didn't ask for a count, didn't record names. She just declared the motion passed unanimously. That word again. Unanimous. Final. Absolute. That's when she looked at me and said it. She said the HOA would proceed with a lawsuit to enforce compliance and recover costs. She said it gently, with that same practiced calm, as if she were doing me a favor by being honest. And then she smiled, not because she was happy, but because she believed this was the moment I'd fold, that the threat of court, of legal fees and public judgment would finally scare me into giving up. But something shifted inside me instead. Sitting there, surrounded by people who wouldn't meet my gaze, I realized the intimidation hadn't worked. The fines hadn't worked. The public shaming hadn't worked. If anything, they'd confirmed what my grandmother had always warned me about. This wasn't about rules or community. It was about power asserting itself and expecting obedience. The meeting ended abruptly. Karen gathered her papers, already moving on. Already planning her next steps. I walked out feeling oddly calm. Not because I wasn't scared, but because the line had been crossed. There was no more pretending this could be resolved quietly. No more hoping reason would win on its own. They'd chosen court, convinced I'd break under the weight of it. The summons arrived 3 days later, delivered to my door in a plain envelope that carried more threat than any fine ever had. She left me more than land, she left proof. That realization hit me the moment I sat across from the attorney's desk, the court summons still fresh in my mind and Karen's confident smile refusing to fade. I had brought the envelope my grandmother left behind, the one I'd avoided opening out of grief and guilt. Now it felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. Like it carried not just instructions, but intention. This wasn't sentiment. This was strategy. The lawyer broke the seal carefully, reading aloud in a steady, deliberate voice. As the words filled the room, something shifted in me. This wasn't a vague will full of general wishes and emotional language. It was precise, clinical. My grandmother had documented the land with a level of detail that surprised even the attorney. Boundary descriptions referenced fixed landmarks, historical measurements, and adjacent properties that predated the HOA by decades. Each line felt like a rebuttal to every accusation Karen had thrown at me. What stunned me most was how intentional it all was. The will didn't just state what I inherited. It explained why. It acknowledged future disputes, anticipated challenges, and addressed them head-on. There were explicit clauses excluding homeowner associations from any claim, authority, or administrative control over the property. My grandmother had seen this coming. Maybe not Karen Holloway specifically, but the kind of person who believes paper power outranks history. Sitting there, listening, I felt equal parts anger and admiration. She had prepared for a fight she knew she wouldn't be alive to see. Then the lawyer unfolded a handwritten letter, tucked neatly inside the will. Seeing her handwriting again caught me off guard. The letter wasn't legal language. It was her voice. She explained that developers had tried for years to absorb the land, that offers and threats had come and gone, and that she never trusted systems built to benefit those in charge. She wrote that HOAs often claim order but thrive on ambiguity, and that ambiguity is where people lose what's theirs. She told me she loved me, trusted me, and believed I'd know when to stand firm. I felt something I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. Validation. Not just emotional comfort, but solid ground beneath my feet. The harassment, the fines, the threats. None of it was imagined. None of it meant I was wrong. My grandmother had known exactly what kind of pressure would be applied and had armed me accordingly. The fear I'd been carrying started to transform into resolve. The attorney leaned back after finishing and told me plainly that this will change everything. It didn't just support my claim. It undermined the HOA's authority entirely. Karen's survey, her unanimous decisions, her confidence, all of it suddenly looked fragile. For the first time since the signs went up on my fence, I felt like I wasn't reacting anymore. I was responding, but the attorney also frowned slightly and tapped one page. He said the will referenced an attached document, an older deed that should have been included but wasn't in the envelope. A document that would complete the chain of ownership beyond any doubt. Without it, the case was strong. With it, it would be airtight. As I left the office, hope followed me out the door, but so did urgency. Somewhere, there was one more piece of paper my grandmother had counted on. And until I found it, the fight wasn't finished. When truth surfaced, fear replaced arrogance. I could feel it in the sudden shift of tone, the way conversations that had once been smug and dismissive became hurried and vague. As soon as my attorney formally requested supporting records, the confidence Karen and the HOA had carried for months began to crack. The fight had moved out of their controlled environment and into places they couldn't manipulate as easily, and they knew it. The first red flag came from the county records office. The microfilm containing the archived deeds from the 1950s, the very ones the clerk had mentioned, was missing. Not misplaced, not delayed, but unaccounted for. Requests were logged, followed by long pauses and carefully worded explanations that didn't actually explain anything. The clerk I'd spoken to before sounded uneasy this time, her voice lower, as if she were afraid of saying too much. Records like that don't just disappear, especially when no one ever asks for them. Yet somehow, the moment I did, they were gone. At the same time, the HOA's attorney changed. Emails that once arrived promptly became short and evasive. Questions about survey origins and submission dates were answered with references to ongoing review. When my attorney pressed for clarity, the responses grew defensive, then silent. It was clear they were no longer eager to let the process unfold. The closer we got to the truth, the more resistance we met. Karen, who had once thrived on confrontation, suddenly softened. She reached out personally, suggesting a settlement. She framed it as a neighborly compromise, a way to avoid stress and expense. The offer was vague but revealing. She suggested redefining boundaries in a way that would satisfy everyone if I just agreed to drop the challenge. It was the first time she'd acknowledged uncertainty, even indirectly. I declined, and the friendliness vanished as quickly as it appeared. During discovery, things unraveled further. Submission dates on key documents didn't match. Surveys that were supposedly finalized months earlier showed signs of later edits. Filings referenced approvals that hadn't occurred yet at the time they were submitted. Each inconsistency alone might have been brushed off as an error, but together they formed a pattern. Someone had been adjusting the record retroactively, trying to build a paper trail that didn't exist when it mattered. Behind closed doors, the pressure intensified. My attorney warned me to expect delays, procedural obstacles, and attempts to wear me down. The HOA was still betting on exhaustion. They couldn't erase the will, but they could slow everything else, hoping I'd settle just to make it stop. Every move they made felt reactive now, driven by fear rather than authority. Then late one evening, I received an unexpected message. It was from someone I recognized by name but hadn't spoken to before. The former HOA treasurer. The message was brief and cautious. They said they had information that might help my case and that they didn't trust the board anymore. Reading it, I realized the truth hadn't just surfaced. It had started to spread. Guilt cracked where power couldn't. That was the feeling I had as I sat in my truck reading the message from the former HOA treasurer over and over again, my heart pounding harder with each line. This wasn't someone on the outside guessing or speculating. This was someone who had been inside the room, watching decisions get made, watching rules get bent, and finally deciding they couldn't live with it anymore. For months, Karen had relied on silence and fear. Now something human had slipped through the cracks. We met quietly, away from the neighborhood, in a place where no one would ask questions. The treasurer looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for too long. They didn't waste time. They told me straight out that what was happening to my land wasn't a misunderstanding or a bureaucratic mess. It was deliberate. Karen had identified my property as a problem early on, something that complicated development plans and HOA control. From that point forward, the goal wasn't clarification, it was absorption. They explained how meetings were steered, how conversations were framed before anyone else spoke. Karen didn't need unanimous agreement because she manufactured it. She'd circulate summaries instead of full discussions, present options as if they were already decided, and discourage questions by warning of legal exposure. Anyone who pushed back was quietly sidelined. Anyone who stayed silent was rewarded with peace. That was how the board functioned. Then came the emails. Printed copies, time-stamped and organized, showing Karen directing the survey process. Not suggesting, directing. She outlined desired outcomes, pressed for cleaner boundaries, and expressed frustration when early drafts didn't give the HOA enough control. The survey company pushed back at first, warning about accuracy and ethics. Karen responded by reminding them who was paying and hinting that future contracts depended on cooperation. Reading those emails felt like watching the ground shift under her feet in real time. The treasurer also explained something I hadn't considered: insurance. Once the discrepancies and potential misconduct surfaced, the HOA's insurance provider reviewed the case, and then they refused coverage. The actions being taken, they said, fell outside protected governance. That meant if this went to court and the HOA lost, the financial responsibility wouldn't be absorbed quietly. It would land directly on the association and its leadership. Panic followed. That's when Karen started talking about settlements. Hearing all this didn't just strengthen my case. It changed its shape. This was no longer about a disputed boundary. It was about abuse of authority, manipulation of records, and retaliation against a homeowner who refused to comply quietly. My attorney was blunt when I showed him the evidence. He said this shifted the balance decisively. What had once been a defensive fight for my land was becoming an offensive case, exposing how the HOA operated. For the first time since this started, I felt the momentum swing. Karen's confidence suddenly made sense not as strength, but as overreach. She'd pushed too far, trusted too much in silence, and underestimated how far guilt could travel once it found a voice. The intimidation hadn't broken me. It had exposed her. A few days later, the notice came through officially. No more delays. No more maneuvering. The court date was locked in, and this time, I wouldn't be walking in alone. Power collapses when facts walk in. I understood that the moment I stepped into the courtroom and felt the air change. This wasn't the HOA meeting room where Karen controlled the narrative, or my driveway where she spoke in polished threats. This was neutral ground, and for the first time, her confidence didn't dominate the space. It sat beside her like an accessory, noticeable but useless. The tension was thick, the kind that presses against your chest and makes every sound feel amplified. When my attorney began presenting the case, the room went quiet. The will was introduced first, read into record with the same precision I'd heard in his office weeks earlier. The judge listened carefully as the boundaries were described in detail, referencing landmarks, dates, and legal language that predated the HOA by decades. Deeds followed, tracing ownership back through generations, each one reinforcing the same truth. This land hadn't been absorbed. It had been targeted. Then came the survey. On its own, it looked official. Under scrutiny, it started to fall apart. My attorney highlighted the inconsistencies I'd noticed from the start. Shifted landmarks, altered curves, missing references. He introduced the discovery evidence, showing how submission dates didn't align, how revisions appeared after filings should have been final. Each contradiction chipped away at the image Karen had worked so hard to build. What had once been presented as certainty now looked like convenience. Karen took the stand with the same calm posture she'd used from the beginning. At first, her answers were smooth, rehearsed. She spoke about community standards, fiduciary duty, and governance. But the questions kept coming, and the facts didn't bend. When asked about directing the survey process, she hesitated. When presented with emails, she deflected. When asked why a vote was rushed without proper notice, her explanations grew tangled. Confidence can't replace truth under oath. The judge leaned forward as the testimony continued, asking pointed questions that cut through the noise. He questioned the HOA's authority to redefine boundaries without clear consent. He questioned the reliance on a single survey in the face of conflicting historical records. He questioned the pattern of fines and enforcement used while ownership was still in dispute. Each question landed heavy, and I could see Karen's composure slipping, just enough to reveal the strain underneath. Sitting there, listening, I felt something I hadn't felt since this began. Balance. The power dynamics that had defined every interaction up to this point were gone. Karen wasn't in control. The board wasn't shielded by silence. The truth stood on its own, supported by documents and testimony that didn't care who felt entitled. After closing arguments, the judge sat back, reviewing his notes. The room held its breath. He looked up, his expression unreadable, and said he would take a brief recess before issuing his ruling. As he stood and left the bench, I realized how far this had come. Everything Karen had built rested on what happened next. Justice arrived without apology. The judge returned to the bench with no dramatic pause, no warning tone, just a steady presence that made the room fall silent all over again. When he spoke, his voice was measured and firm, the kind that didn't need volume to carry weight. He ruled that the land was mine, legally and unequivocally, supported by the will, the historical deeds, and the evidence of misconduct presented. The words landed slowly, then all at once, like a door finally opening after being locked from the outside. He didn't stop there. The HOA's actions were called what they were: overreach. The fines imposed during an active ownership dispute were deemed improper. The altered survey submissions were described as misleading. Sanctions were ordered, financial penalties that would sting, and corrective actions mandated to prevent anything like this from happening again. Listening to it unfold, I felt the tension I'd been carrying for months start to loosen, muscle by muscle, breath by breath. Karen sat still as the ruling continued, her expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and calculation. When the judge addressed governance failures and conflicts of interest, it became clear this wasn't a narrow win. The HOA was ordered to restructure its enforcement procedures, and leadership accountability was emphasized in unmistakable terms. Karen was removed as president, effective immediately, barred from holding that position again. For someone who had spoken with such certainty for so long, the silence around her felt deafening. Walking out of the courtroom, I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt lightheaded, like I'd been holding my breath for too long and had forgotten how to breathe normally. Outside, neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months approached me hesitantly. Some apologized outright, admitting they'd been afraid to say anything. Others simply shook my hand, their eyes downcast, acknowledging what they'd watched happen without intervening. I didn't feel anger toward them anymore. Fear has a way of shrinking people. I knew that better than anyone. Back home, the land felt different, even though nothing had physically changed. The fence was still there. The grass still moved with the wind, same way it always had, but the weight was gone. The sense that someone else could rewrite my reality with paperwork and threats had lifted. For the first time since the signs went up, my home felt like mine again. That night, I sat on the porch thinking about my grandmother, about how she'd prepared for this without ever telling me exactly how. She hadn't lived to see the outcome, but she'd believed in it. She'd trusted that if the truth was preserved carefully enough, it would survive long enough to matter. Standing there, I felt my dignity return. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like something that had been waiting patiently to come back. But with the victory came a question I hadn't expected to face so soon. The HOA's attorney reached out the next day, careful and restrained, to discuss next steps. The land was mine, beyond dispute, but the attention it had drawn wasn't going away overnight. Developers would notice. Offers would come. Selling would be easy now, profitable even. Walking away would be understandable after everything that had happened. I stood at the fence line again, the same place where this all began, and realized the fight had given me something I hadn't known I'd lost. Not just ownership, but clarity. This land wasn't just property. It was a line my family had drawn and held, generation after generation. Letting it go would end the conflict, but it would also end the story my grandmother had trusted me to carry forward. The verdict had taken back more than land. It had given me a choice. Some scars deserved to stay visible. That's what I kept telling myself as I stood at the fence line in the quiet days after the verdict, running my hand along the rough wood where those bright orange violation notices had once been nailed like accusations. People suggested replacing it, cleaning it up, making everything look new again. But I didn't want new. I wanted memory. I wanted proof that what happened here wasn't just whispered about and forgotten once the paperwork changed hands. The offers came quickly. Developers, investors, even a couple of real estate agents who spoke in soothing voices about moving on and turning the page. They reminded me how much money the land was suddenly worth now that the dispute was settled. After everything I'd been through, selling would have been easy. No more HOA tension, no more eyes watching, no more risk. But every time I considered it, I thought about my grandmother walking this same ground, refusing to be pushed, refusing to sign away what she knew mattered. Selling would have felt like undoing her final stand. So I decided not to sell. I kept the land exactly as it was. The fence stayed where it had always been, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. It marked a boundary that had been challenged and defended. It stood as a quiet warning that not everything can be absorbed just because someone with authority wants it to be. Anyone who walked by could see it, plain and unremarkable, and that was the point. Power hates reminders. The community changed too, slowly at first, then all at once. With Karen gone, the HOA was forced to reckon with what had been allowed to happen. Meetings became public in a way they never had before. Rules were rewritten. Oversight was added. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down started asking questions, demanding transparency. I didn't lead that charge, but I watched it unfold with a mix of relief and caution. Trust, once broken, doesn't come back easily. Still, it was something to see people choose accountability over comfort. One evening, the HOA held a small gathering, not to celebrate, but to acknowledge. They invited me to speak, something I never imagined happening months earlier. I talked about the land, about history, about how easy it is to mistake silence for agreement. I talked about my grandmother, about how she believed ownership wasn't just legal, it was moral. When I finished, there was a moment of quiet that felt heavier than applause. In that silence, I knew her legacy had been heard. At home, life settled into a rhythm again. The kids stopped asking if we were in trouble. My wife slept through the night without waking to check emails. The fear that had lived with us for so long finally moved out. In its place was something steadier. Confidence, maybe, or peace earned the hard way. I found myself appreciating small things more, like the sound of the wind through the trees my grandmother used to point out. Still standing, still rooted. Looking back, I understand now why this fight mattered so much. It was never just about land or fines or surveys. It was about what happens when authority goes unchecked and people are expected to shrink quietly. It was about whether intimidation gets rewarded simply because it's exhausting to resist. Standing my ground didn't make me fearless. It made me honest. Honest about what I was willing to lose and what I wasn't. The fence still stands today, not as a symbol of anger, but of memory. It reminds me, and anyone else who needs reminding, that rights don't disappear just because someone with a title says they do. They disappear when people stop defending them. I didn't keep the fence out of spite. I kept it so they'd remember. So I'd remember. Power only works when good people stay silent. If you've ever been harassed, fined, threatened, or humiliated by people hiding behind rules, this is your story too. Stand your ground. Share your truth. Power breaks when it's exposed.